So welcome everyone to our third and final October webinar on cultural responsiveness and outdoor learning. And I'm really excited for our webinar today and feel really fortunate that we've had a great response to our whole webinar series that is focused on an introduction to outdoor learning in various ways, including social-emotional learning. Last week we explored standards-aligned outdoor learning, and then this week we're exploring cultural responsiveness. So I'm Eileen Everett. I'm the Director of Environmental Education of New Mexico, and I'm going to help set the stage for our conversation today. And just a quick reminder to folks that we do have a free statewide listserv available where we post events that we host, like these webinars, as well as serving as a space for people to share information about other opportunities. And you can join this free listserv by visiting our website and clicking under Join and clicking on the EcoEd listserv tab, and we welcome you to join us. And as we get settled in today, I do want to take a few moments for us to locate ourselves. So I'd like to encourage all of you, wherever you are calling in from, to take a moment to ground yourselves. Go ahead and make sure that your feet are planted on the ground. If you feel comfortable grounding yourself by sitting, that's a great way to do it. If you want to sit on the floor, on the ground, you can do that. If you want to stand up and move, it's whatever feels right for you. And as we get into especially this conversation today around cultural responsiveness, it is so important, especially for us as an organization, to pause and acknowledge the histories of the lands that we live, work, and play on, and all of these lands that we use across New Mexico for outdoor learning. In particular, I want to highlight that there are historical and current traumas as a result of how our cultures have interacted in the past and in the present here in New Mexico, and that there are many histories that have intentionally been made invisible across our lands of New Mexico, especially with our 23 Native nations and our many indigenous people across the state. And that when we're talking about outdoor learning and thinking about the places that we are exploring for outdoor learning, that so many of these lands across New Mexico have histories that have yet to be told. And as educators and those that support outdoor learning in various forms for our students, we have a real opportunity to help make visible some of those histories that have intentionally been made invisible. So before we actually get into our conversation and I continue and lay the groundwork, I'm just going to have a moment of quiet and invite everyone to locate yourself and honor our places, our histories, our cultures, our indigenous people, our Native nations, however it feels appropriate for you. And as we get going in our conversation and getting into thinking about cultural responsiveness, I'm going to invite everyone in the chat box to share a little bit about yourselves so we start getting a feeling for who's joining us here today. And in the chat box, we would love for folks to share. Give me just a moment so I can put these prompts in for everyone. If you could, please share the following information, as much or as little as you would like to share. But in the chat box, if you can please add your name, pronouns. I've lost my chat box already. Name, pronouns. If you represent a group, school, organization, feel free to share that. Can also feel free to share your location. And why is outdoor learning important to you? We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. I'd also like to take a moment to highlight that earlier this month, we were really fortunate here in New Mexico to have our public education department release outdoor learning guidance connected to the 2020 to 2021 school year reentry plan for the state of New Mexico. And New Mexico really truly is a leader. It appears to actually be the only state right now, or one of the only states that has outdoor learning guidance to support our kids and our communities and being in the outdoors, especially in the value of that is just so needed and so important, especially right now during COVID. And as an organization, we actually worked on drafting those guidelines with many of you. I feel so fortunate that we have an incredible leadership team. We have a great group of fellows that we worked with, and many in our community. We put the call out to all of you, and you responded to help us with drafting those outdoor learning guidance that were eventually approved and released by the Public Education Department to every public school teacher and school administrator across the state earlier this month. And to support that outdoor learning guidance, we also created this new website called outdoorlearningnm.org. That's where we keep the recordings from these webinars and resources and notes that we're going to share out. And as you can see from this screenshot, we have resources and support that we've curated for parents, guardians, and families, as well as teachers, school staff, and administrators. So we definitely hope that folks can share that information out so that we can get as many of our kids outdoors as possible, whether it be at home, in communities, or at schools in this time period. I also want to take a moment to talk a little bit about who we are as an organization, and to highlight that as an organization, we have been in a transformation process. And this transformation process that we've been engaged in the last few years is really rooted in equity and inclusion, and how can we as an organization that supports outdoor and environmental education and learning really strive to become more equitable and more inclusive of the many communities around New Mexico. And one way we've done this is beginning 3 years ago, we actually engaged in a community-centered strategic planning process. And these next few slides I'm going to share, all of this information is available on our website. You all can feel free to reach out if you would like to learn more about this process or have questions or insights to share, and I'll put my email in the chat box. You can always feel free to reach out anytime so we can chat more about this. But for the last 3 years, we've been really engaged in going to the community to ask all of you, how do we define outdoor and environmental learning? And how can we as an organization better support the many different approaches to engaging in the outdoors across New Mexico? We've done this mostly through community dialogues with many of you, and we very much view environmental, outdoor education and learning as being connected to so many different other areas like conservation, outdoor recreation, community engagement, local food and food justice, environmental justice, thinking about our connections to public lands. So we don't view this learning just by itself, but as a system that connects to many other things. We've explored a whole variety of topics of how do we switch our approaches, even as practitioners out in the world, as educators and teachers, to support the whole student to become student and community centered in our own ways. We've explored things like the interconnectedness of outdoor and environmental learning to access to the outdoors, and how does that connect to the social impact and the change that we all, as a shared vision, want to see in the world. And one way we are continuing to explore these conversations this year is through a really great fellowship program. And I know we have a couple of fellows on today. Most of our fellows are actually in their end of month check-in on another Zoom right now, or else we'd have more fellows joining us. But I can't say enough about our 17 incredible Exploring Equitable Education Outdoors fellows. We have fellows from all across New Mexico who represent not just education, but conservation, recreation, all different ways of supporting our youth and engaging in the outdoors, and even youth employment in the outdoors. And our fellows have done such incredible systems thinking and systems mapping this work. And in just a couple of months, we're going to release the report from the 3 years of community work we've been engaged in to prioritize the shared vision that we have of every kid, every day, every way. So as an organization, we believe that every child in New Mexico, pre-K through 12th grade age, should have the opportunity on a daily basis, at home, in communities, at schools, and through further away experiences, the opportunity to be in the outdoors and engage in environmental learning in local, relevant, and meaningful ways. We also continuously strive to lift up the many different approaches and ways to engage in the outdoors, and recognize that there's many different forms of education and learning, and that as a community, it benefits all of us to not just view being in the outdoors as one type of experience, but as many types of experiences. And we're going to have an opportunity to explore a little bit of that today. And I do also want to name as an organization that our mission is through implementing an advocacy-focused movement, as well as advancing collaboration and leadership. Environmental education of New Mexico will ensure every New Mexico child has equitable access to environmental and outdoor learning, as well as to the outdoors. So, having shared all of that, it is now my pleasure to actually get us into this conversation. And one of the great opportunities that I have in my role supporting our larger community is that I get to work with really thoughtful systems thinkers all of the time. And in this transformation that our organization has been undergoing the last few years, we have intentionally made some shifts, especially around shared power and shared leadership, among how I, as a staff member of the organization, interact with our board of directors. And we now collectively view ourselves as a leadership team, that we have different perspectives and experiences, and we strive continuously to really honor what everyone brings to the table. We have some leadership team members who are going to be our panelists. I see a couple who are participants, like Marcia Barton and Steve Glass. If you're a leadership team member and are not a panelist, if you can just let us know in the chat box so that folks get a better understanding of who our leaders are. And while the rest of our leadership team is doing that, it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Tally and Vanessa, who are two incredible members of our leadership team. Before I pass things off to them, though, I do just want to say, Tally and Vanessa, it is such an honor to work with both of you. You each have different backgrounds and different experiences, professional and lived experiences, that as the person who sits in this role to support the community, I depend upon both of you to go to seek your advice and wisdom and perspective, and you give it so freely. And so I'm really excited to get into this conversation with you both. And Tally and Vanessa, would you both mind sharing a little bit more about yourselves? And let's go with Tally first.
Hi, everyone. It's really exciting to be here with you all. Thank you, Eileen and Vanessa, for the opportunity to have this conversation together. I'm really happy and honored to do that, and really thrilled to see all the folks who are in the Zoom with us, and really sort of honored to be with you all as well. Many experts and wonderful perspectives already in the Zoom outside of myself and Vanessa. So just a little bit about me. I today am joining you from Cuesta, New Mexico, way up in the north. We had like 18 inches of snow on Sunday night. And so I've just like recently gotten my car out of like the snowy driveway and out into the world where there's internet and not at my house. And I'm from Albuquerque originally. My family lives there, and I have spent probably like 15 years working in environmental education in different kinds of capacities, and have worked with some of you that are in the call, and it's been such an honor and a pleasure. I'm always like learning so much from everybody that I work with. And right now, I guess my role right now is as a graduate student. I'm kind of middle way into a PhD program, and my focus in doing research is on kind of knowledge politics in environmental education. So some of what we're talking about today is like very much like right in line with what my work is on, and I'll be talking a little bit about some other research that I worked on while I was doing a master's program in Northern Arizona. Yeah, and I'm a part of the leadership team, and it's a thrill to be with EENM in that capacity. Thanks.
And hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Barella. I go by she, her, hers. I'm really happy to be here. I recognize some of the names from last week if you were on the webinar. So it's great to see some of those familiar names again, um, and just have people willing to do this. Some of the stuff that I'm going to be sharing today, I think, is really going to challenge some of your thinking in some ways that you've thought about doing activities with youth before or students in general. Um, Irregardless if it's in the classroom or if it's outdoors. Because when I was in the classroom as a formal educator, it wasn't ever something I was taught about being culturally responsive. It was never anything in teacher training programs. It was just something you were kind of thrown into and uh, you pick up on as you're going. So I'm really excited to share some of the things um, that we've been working on in my role at work. I work for the Sandia Mountain Natural History Center, which is a kind of confusing entity. We are half a part of Albuquerque Public Schools and half a part of the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. And I am from the museum side, so I'm a state employee. But we've been working on this in the Department of Cultural Affairs, which oversees all the museums, the historic sites, the heritage sites, um, at a very high level. And it's also something that the Public Education Department started working on this year um, as well. So that's where some of our conversations have stemmed from. Um, so I'm really excited just to share with you guys and get you guys thinking about some things that you've maybe never thought about before that are really important.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And as we get into this conversation, and I think back to our first webinar earlier this month on social and emotional learning, and it was similar, what I'm about to share, that terms like social and emotional learning and cultural relevancy and being culturally responsive are terms that we often hear, but too frequently we don't necessarily have a shared definition of what we actually mean when we're talking about these things. So as we get going here, Tally and Vanessa, do you mind just providing a little bit more context for us around what does cultural responsiveness mean to you?
I can go first. Okay, so what I wrote down a number of thoughts about what cultural responsiveness means to me. So first of all, my entry point into this is through reading a lot around culturally responsive pedagogy and critical race theory. And so from Gloria Ladson-Billing, who's like sort of my hero in this, she's a scholar, an education scholar, she says culturally responsive teaching is a pedagogy that recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. So for me, I think that's like a really great starting place. What I think cultural responsiveness takes account of is that there's a reality that a dominant culture here in the United States, from which many of the narratives and assumptions that underpin the stories that we tell and the entry points that we develop and the framings that we use and the context we teach from, the dominant culture has a context, and the learners that we work with are coming to our tables with funds of knowledge, experience, and ways of knowing that shape their own understanding from their family, from their community, from their cultural understandings of things, of the things that we as educators might teach. And their context might differ from this dominant context. Cultural responsiveness also creates a space for and celebrates many narratives and ways of knowing that count, and what counts as outdoor learning. I think that's really important, that like what counts as. So responsiveness means creating space for learners to start from what they know or where they know and build connections to other concepts that we may aim to cover as educators. Cultural responsiveness also works to understand the power dynamics embedded in, again, there's a thing of what counts as knowledge. And so understanding the power dynamics of what counts as knowledge, and involves efforts of sharing power around knowledge by encouraging learners to tap into those funds of knowledge. I have two quotes, one from Oscar Quagley: all learning should start with what the student and the community know. And doing this centers knowledge produced at the community level and legitimized through its usefulness to the community, including not only the people, but plants, animals, and the whole of nature. And that's from Gregory Cajete. So I'll hand it over to Vanessa.
I couldn't find my mute button. So a lot of what culturally responsiveness means to me in like a more informal way is recognizing that all of our students are going to have a different background, different home values, different life, and different experiences, and honoring that, and working towards bridging that and bringing it into the classroom, and validating and affirming what a student has or hasn't experienced. And a lot of people have heard of Holly. He is a great person to read. He talks a lot about culturally and linguistically responsive teaching and learning. And one of the things from him is that educators need to respond to students by taking into account their cultural and linguistic factors from their home environment, students to master the concept of situational appropriateness. And he really discusses that educators really need to create that positive school environment by validating and affirming students' home languages and cultures, and making that home language and culture legitimate in their classroom, while affirming or making it clear that those things are positive assets for those students, because it is very good. And then you can bridge all of those experiences into the classroom, and help create a really good school culture. So to me, cultural responsiveness is taking everything that you are learning and you know about the students you are going to be working with, and integrating that and allowing them to express the things that are culturally relevant to them and how they are going to learn. So now I'll go back to Eileen. Or no, go back to Tally, I guess.
Okay, so shall I just sort of start into my piece? All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you all and kind of walk through a few things about cultural responsiveness that, well, actually, like, sort of first thinking about the question of like, why do we need to be culturally responsive? What about our world has been unresponsive? I think that it's always really important to start there. Some of what I spend my time kind of like working on and thinking about is the idea of inclusion and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and the ways in which when we talk about inclusion, we can sort of forget to address the issues that created the need for inclusion, which is the exclusion. So I'm going to be honest, and it might be confusing, I'm on two screens. I'm sorry, my webcam doesn't work. So that is why I'm like not looking at you. But and also I totally have stolen or borrowed this comic from a presentation that I saw online at the NAAE conference last week about cultural responsiveness. And it was like, wow, that comic by Charlie Bink is very good at showcasing the issue of what the problem is. Okay, so like the problem, we have these shapes here and there's a voice coming through the first, there's a hole in a wall and there's a voice coming through. I don't know what you guys are complaining about. If you want to make it through, just be yourself. That's a circle, and the hole in the wall is a circle. Okay, so like the problem is not the shapes. The problem of getting through to the other side is the wall. And I think cultural responsiveness, like to think about that, we also have to think about like, what is the wall in our way that's preventing the shapes, the different, all of our learners and all of ourselves are coming with different stories and a broad variety of cultures that we're bringing with us everywhere we go and into the outdoor learning space or into the classroom. What is the wall that's in the way of us sort of fully being ourselves and making it all the way through and thriving? So I think taking account of those structural issues is really important. And people like Gloria Ladson-Billings and other scholars who use critical race theory in education, and I'll show you some of that theory in a minute, really work to examine the structural inequities and the structural harm that comes from these types of barriers. So there's also some like structural benefits that these types of barriers create for our circles. So we want to like be paying attention to those. Maybe there's a legitimization of deficiencies if we're not thinking through like cultural responsiveness, so that like certain types of behavior or ways of knowing or ways of thinking or ways of being are kind of categorized as like not following the rules or following the norm. So we want to like challenge ourselves to look at that normalizing or legitimizing of deficiencies as a wall, okay? We want to break down that wall. And other kind of structural issues that we might kind of find culturally specific artifacts like our wall with the circle in it, you know, can be found in our practices and the designs, in our curricula, and effectively, and specifically from critical race theory, these things like privileged white European, affluent, elite, and anthropocentric, so male-centered culture, and they require an assimilation to it. And in particular, I think this is true for a lot of our dominant narratives around nature and the outdoors. Okay, so we can have a lot of concerns for the homogenizing and the assimilation of ways of knowing and being, and we want to pay attention to how those things, ways of knowing, ways of being, are kind of grounded in dominant discourse. We want to crack open some space and sort of break down this wall. Culturally responsive pedagogies make space for that. So what I wanted to do was kind of show you how an example of this. So I'm going to be sharing some research. This is from my master's work at Northern Arizona University, and that project was called Youth Rewriting Nature Master Scripts. I worked with 7th and 8th grade students at a middle school, it's a charter school in Flagstaff, and the problem I was working on was really around like, what is it about the environmental movement and environmental education that kind of lends itself to being such a homogenous community? What, you know, some of those questions came from a personal place, like, you know, people ask me all the time, why aren't there more people of color in this field teaching environmental education? I would often speak, you know, from my own experience, like, I don't know, I love being outside. I have, you know, my own background that I bring to my profession as a Black woman, and I can't speak for everybody, but I was curious also. So my entry point into this question really was around, like, what is it about the narratives of nature that act as that wall, that kind of very much have the circle in the middle, and there's like one way through. So what I did with these young folks was we asked the question, you know, when young people are encouraged to deconstruct dominant narratives of nature, how do they reconstruct narratives of nature, and in what ways are those narratives polycultural? And that was just the word we used to talk about, like, many layers or diverse, and what ways do they kind of add things? Polyculture comes from permaculture, but it also comes from, you can think about it in terms of culture. We hire like multitudes, we bring many cultures to whatever we're doing, and so how can we make space for all of those kind of parts of our identity to have a say in what the narrative of environment or nature or outdoors is. So I operated from the like a theoretical framework of critical race theory, and I used some particular concepts, but I won't get too much into that. I think in terms of working around cultural responsiveness, critical race theory is awesome because it's kind of questions, like it adds some questions into like sort of what kind of knowledge and whose knowledge counts and whose stories are accounted for. It takes as everyday ordinary the existence of and the experience of racism, in particular people of color in the United States. And because racism is ordinary, it's difficult to address. So that's like the first principle of critical race theory. We're dealing with with experiences and with systems of oppression that are everyday and ordinary, and we have to kind of open them up and look at them, dismantle them, deconstruct them, and then rebuild. So critical race theory also looks at how there's little interest to eradicate racism unless it serves a purpose to the dominant group. That's called interest convergence. Groups are racialized differently at different points in time, and these shifting relationships really connect to the political economy. So we're not just thinking about racism as like interaction between individuals or even communities, but really it's like layers and layers of society, from those interactions between individuals and communities to like our whole kind of economic structure. Important for culturally responsive approaches, critical race theory focuses on storytelling and personal experience that offer authority to voices that are often marginalized, criminalized, erased. It's an interdisciplinary theoretical framework, so you can bring in all sorts of other kinds of components to understand, like to have more intersectional ways of approaching your cultural responsiveness. And that means like maybe you need to focus on kind of the different languages spoken in your group, or the different kind of abilities and disabilities that are represented, or both, and gender, and all of the things you can just build from this. Okay, so we used this framework to kind of run our research project, and that means that we focused on storytelling. So the students came from a neighborhood in Flagstaff that it's a historic neighborhood. It was majority people of color, which is not the case for most neighborhoods in Flagstaff. So it's a relatively segregated area. There were 23 students with different identities. When asked to self-identify, this is sort of this bottom paragraph is how the students identified themselves. These were the things that were important for them. So they, again, there's our polyculture. There are multitudes. So we focused on storytelling. That was the method. And we did all kinds of things. We're going to do an exercise in a minute that is part of what I did with the students is like our research project. We did a thing called, we made a culture map. So we did storytelling through maps because we wanted to like actually layer in some standards into the classroom, and I was working with like the science and social studies teacher. So we created maps and told stories through maps. Maps are an excellent way to like think about storytelling and also think about dominant narratives and like who's narrating the landscape. So the culture map is another kind of tool to just kind of reflect on what all the parts of your identity that you're bringing to the table. We did some sort of walkabouts in the neighborhood and drew some stories about where do we spend our time in the neighborhood. And then the final map was a story of nature map. So they could combine all of these different maps that we had done, different exercises that we had done. The students did interviews with family members, talk about nature, and they created a story of nature map. And then we did some interviews to kind of talk through what those maps were. And the point of this was to deconstruct dominant narratives of nature, which I know I haven't shared with you what that is, but I will in a moment, and reconstruct more polycultural narratives. So from all of these different components of work that we did together as students, starting with their experience with themselves, with their neighborhoods, with our communities, the different communities, doing interviews with people in their communities and the community as a whole, and then creating these stories, the students kind of came up with three kind of narrative themes, or four narrative themes that these are like what I think of these as useful entry points for starting like a culturally responsive conversation around the environment or nature. These are a tool basically as an environmental educator for me to sort of find a new way to start talking about what nature is that isn't, that really kind of creates space for the students to or the learners to share what they feel nature is, what their relationship to nature and the outdoors is. So the four themes were that you belong here, and that nature keeps us alive. So there were all these wonderful ways in which being alive was a good starting point for teaching about the outdoors and about nature. Nature is everything and everywhere, sort of. So these students were really good at holding on to multiple narratives. They could bring in their personal experience, but also sometimes they were sharing what they would learn about nature from like the Discovery Channel or Nat Geo, or some of the just kind of more mainstream messaging that they might get from dominant culture. And also you could just go outside. So it's one of the questions that they kind of responded to as we were doing our work together was where is nature? Where is nature? And so you just go outside, and it might be, in the town or the city streets, and it might be on the farm, and it might be in the mountains with your ATV, and it might be at the railroad tracks where the prairie dogs are. So anyhow, these were the narrative beginnings for these students that just drew again on their own experience and their families and their communities. So the data, actually, what I use as data were these maps. The students and I kind of did analysis together, and then I did more analysis after they were finished with school. But one of the comments that I remember most profoundly from one of the students in doing this project, because we spent like 5 weeks together, which was a lot of time for me to come into the classroom space. So that was really generous of the school, was that no one was telling them they were wrong. So when they were doing this project. So I think there were so much more to do and so much more to the relationship in the project to build. We bumped up against the end of the school year, but it's just like a really exciting and energizing and generative starting place to kind of take from the students what they think first. So I know I didn't really share with you what I meant by dominant narrative, so I'm going to give you an example of this now, and then we were going to break out into breakout rooms and just have some discussion about different kinds of narratives that highlight nature or the outdoors or outdoor engagement, and kind of do some deconstructing, which is sort of looking critically at what we're seeing in the text and then kind of talking about what and I'll give you some prompts, but like what feels or what kind of connects to being culturally responsive and what feels maybe assimilative or oppressive even. So we'll look at some different narratives in a moment, but I wanted to give you an example of this. And this is what I use with the students as well, as a dominant narrative about nature and the natural world to deconstruct. So this is from Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, which he published in the 80s. And I do think he would write something different now, which is great because there's always room for us to grow. But he says, one proof of the deep-rooted desire for pristine places is the decision that Americans and others have made to legislate wilderness, to set aside vast tracts of land where, in the words of federal law, the earth and its community of life are untrammeled, meaning undisturbed by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Pristine nature, we recognize, has been overwhelmed in many places, even in our national parks. But it is in these few spots that it makes a stand. If we can't have places where no man has been, we can at least have spots where no man is at the moment. So I will pause there, and I'm going to stop sharing. Well, I'm going to go leave my PowerPoint and go to this blog here. So we thought we could spend a little bit of time, and Eileen, I don't know, do we actually have time to do this? Yeah, okay. So we have this Bill McKibben example, and then that's sort of the dominant narrative that we can be critical of. We can take it apart and look at it and think about the assumptions that he makes in that. And then Vanessa and I were talking about other places, and actually Instagram is a really great place to get narratives from all sorts of people and from different cultural backgrounds and whatnot on narratives about nature. And a really Latino Outdoors actually has a blog called Yo Cuento, and they have people share their stories. So the other set of narratives that we can kind of take a look at to deconstruct are some of these examples from the Yo Cuento blog. And so it's not sharing. It's not sharing this. Let me see how I switch. I want to move to this one. Stop my share. And share it again.
While
There we go.
Oh, let's see if it's there.
Okay. So here's the Yo Cuento blog, and I will send the link in the chat, and we'll split up into breakout rooms, and for a short time just take a couple of minutes to read maybe one or two of these blog posts, and then also look at that Bill McKibben. I'll share the Bill McKibben quote again. And the questions that we're reflecting on are kind of what here jumps out at us as like culturally responsive, and what feels like it connects to dominant narrative. And basically the idea is that there should be room for both, or, more room for culturally responsive. You can have that discussion as well, but just think through these different short narratives, what feels like it's responding to culture and what feels like it's actually kind of forcing an assimilation to specific ideas about nature or the outdoors. All right, chat.
All right, so while Tally puts that in the chat, we're going to also broadcast the link once you all are in your breakout room. So if you don't have time to copy this link, just please know it will be sent to you once you're in the breakout rooms. I do also want to remind folks, if you've engaged with any of our community dialogues, so many of our events that we normally host are very interactive. And I want to acknowledge that this is a little bit different format that we've been trying out. But I do want to remind folks that it's really important for us to have community agreements so that we have a shared understanding of how we are going to interact with one another.
Also, it's really great to see your faces. So thank you for leaving your cameras on. There's never enough time for these conversations, and we do want to hear, what came up for you. So if there's something from your group that you want to share out from the conversation or reflection from reading one of the cuentos, please do that in the chat. And then I wanted to just also point out actually that on the Cuentos blog, or the Yo Cuento blog, there's a opportunity to share your story. And if you look at what they offer as a prompt for sharing your story, I think those are like really excellent places to start with some kind of culturally responsive exercises, activities, conversation starters for outdoor educators. So there is a teaching tool right there on that blog. So yes, please share your insights in the chat, and I am going to hand things over to Vanessa. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so let me share my stuff. All right, so whoop, I always make this mistake. So what we're gonna really talk about and explore for this part is culturally responsive lesson plans and how you take the activities and things that you do with students and incorporate that into your planning. So before you even encounter students. So this is kind of the things that we're going to talk about. We're going to shorten it just a little bit to be mindful of time. So we're going to go through some culturally responsive lesson plan statements, what's coming from PED. We're going to do a little reflective activity and then a wrap up. So thinking about, I know there's a variety of educators on here and a variety of ways that we work with students. So New Mexico follows all of these different standards. And these are all of the types of standards we have. So we use Common Core and NGSS, which are national standards. And we also use the National Visual and Performing Arts Standards. And then the rest of these standards, the CTE, the World Readiness is a national standard, but the Career and Technical Education is New Mexico. Health Education is New Mexico. So a lot of them are made in state. And some things that have started to come down from the Public Education Department, they released 2 instructional scopes this year. The New Mexico Language Arts Instructional Scope and the New Mexico Mathematics Instructional Scope. And I'll put those links in the chat in a little bit. But the big parts of these instructional scopes was they gathered a large group of educators in the state and allowed everyone to really look at what the standards are and how you include cultural responsiveness in that standard and how you make sure to connect it to students' family and home lives in language arts and mathematics. So those were the 2 targets that came from PED this past summer. So things that are included on there are the instructional tenets, the planning guidance, resources, culturally and linguistically responsive instructions, assessment examples, and cross-curricular connections. They're really, really large documents. And there are some guides on how to look at them if that's something that you're looking at. And the plans as of a few weeks ago were that they were going to start looking towards doing the same thing with social studies. The New Mexico social studies standards haven't been updated for believe, at least 10 or 12 years at this point. And so they're wanting to do something very similar. So this is something that the administration in the public education department is looking towards and being mindful about culturally and linguistically responsive education and instruction with students. So all of these were based on the 5 equity-based teaching practices. So it's go deep with the content. So you develop students' conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, problem solving and reasoning within their content area. Use multiple competencies. So use the strengths that you know students have as a way for their learning. Affirm a learner's identity. So promote their participation and value in ways of contributing. Challenge the space of marginality. So embrace what students have as competencies, their multiple contributions, and position students as sources as expertise. They have a lot to share and a lot of knowledge, and then draw on all of their different knowledge. So draw on, what they know from math, what they know from language, their culture, their family, and use those as the resources for learning. So those are the 5 equity-based teaching practices that all of this was based off of. So we're going to explore a document that was curated this summer with PED in some working groups. And this document that I'm going to share can be a way for you to start thinking about these kinds of statements and putting them into your practice. So what we're going to do, I have some discussion that we're going to do. So just, as a disclaimer, the suggestions for the discussion that we're going to look at and some things I'm going to share with you guys are designed for an educator to intentionally plan to support students from marginalized cultures and languages, and ensure that we can counteract any negative or missing images or representations of their home culture or language. Because in order for students to view themselves as confident and competent learners and doers of, I have mathematics here, but within any area and outside of the classroom, we really have to think about these pieces. So before I share with you guys the activity sheet, these are where we're going with it. So I'm going to give you some time to read the lesson plan statement activity sheet. We're not going to do the activity though, but I want you guys to really look at it, review it, think about it, and how you can use it in your activities. How can you use it to inform your activities? What parts do you already do well in this, and what can you do to improve? And then after I give you guys some time to think about it and reflect, we will discuss these 3 questions. And then I have another part for you where you can take this part, on your own and plan on how you can use this information to grow as an educator. So let me share with you guys in the chat the document. And so I have it as a Google Doc for you guys to share. So in this Google Doc is the activity, but I just want you guys to look through it. And really, if you scroll down towards the culturally and linguistic responsive instruction and how you validate and affirm and build and bridge. So I'll be quiet for about 5 minutes to give you guys just some time to look at it. So hopefully you were able to read a good portion of it and really look at it and think about those questions and how they might impact you. So these are the 3 questions that I want us to have a discussion about. So thinking about that document that I shared with you, how can you use that document or those ideas to inform the activities you create or do with students? What do you already do of that? Some some of us already do that naturally in our teaching and in our working with students, but we may have never like formally written it out in a way. And what can you do to improve it? So is there anybody that is willing to share? Go ahead, Riley.
Yeah, I'd love to share. Such an enlightening document. I loved reading it. What immediately came to mind is utilizing the student's experience as an opportunity to teach other students. And where it said, yeah, positioning students as a source of expertise really struck a chord, because it made me really realize that there's this sort of phantom I feel in the classroom of, if an administrator walks in, I better be mid lesson, like teaching, I should be the one talking. And so that's something I really think is so helpful, because we have this like collective knowledge of all of the students' cultural backgrounds in the room. And so something that I already do is celebrating what is shared. So when a student does share something that is personal to them, or that teaches me something, that positively affirming that. But the thing that I can improve is creating more opportunities for students to do so, and really valuing and framing it that way, that, you're a part of, this is a room of learning, not just me teacher, you student, but like this is a room of learning, and that all of you have things that I don't, and things that the other students don't, and that this is an opportunity for you to share your cultural experience, and that it is important and it is valid, and that we want to hear it. It's not boring, it's not stupid, it's not anything negative. This is your experience, which makes it valuable.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think it's so valuable to do that in a classroom, and it really relates, like in education, a lot of times in a teaching program, you're taught about how building a classroom culture is important, but you're never given really good tools on how to do that, or how to honor what the students bring to the classroom. So I appreciate you sharing that. Is there anyone else that wants to share?
I'll go.
Sure.
So one thing that I was looking at on here is it kind of seems to take the opportunity of like whatever tangent something that is brought up on. So it talks about like asking the community to build upon one another's ideas. And so I think for me, oftentimes it's like, okay, we have this thing to teach about and that's what we need to do. But if there's a topic within that a student brings up upon like something that they know about it or their culture that relates to it, like going in that direction, not just being like, oh yeah, that's cool, and then like being like, well, this is what we're doing though, but kind of like exploring those tangents and then allowing other people to implement what they know, and just really like diving into that moment instead of just like acknowledge that's cool, we're still going, but facilitating a group conversation and group ideas about that. And so I think that's one thing that I can improve on and really like dive into, to embrace the tangents, because oftentimes they are very beneficial.
They are, and they're so fun.
They are, yeah.
I was thinking about the first middle school that I taught at. It was 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, and they spoke 81 languages in the school. And I was laughing as I was reading, Vanessa, what you had compiled there, like being culturally responsive to like dozens of different cultures in one classroom. How, I think that acknowledgement is definitely a good foundation, but then the authenticity that a teacher brings to really including all voices and making sure to get the quietest, smallest person's voice heard, to be very conscious about that, and authentic about, I mean, really wanting to hear those voices instead of just like checking off a box of social equity. But I remember, by the way, it was the Rachel Carson Intermediate School. So I liked that it was Rachel. We had a big portrait of Rachel Carson in the entryway when you first came in. Okay, that was one of the, but I'm going to stop with that and let someone else contribute.
Is there anyone else that wants to share or contribute in any way? So I'll share some of my background with this and why this is so important to me, because I didn't really share that with you because I didn't want to overtake a lot of what you guys are sharing. So my real experience with this started as, my first real full-time teaching experience. I worked at a middle school in Denver. It was Manny Martinez Middle School. It was a very poor neighborhood. It has since been gentrified, and a lot of those students that I taught now are displaced from their home, which was a very historic neighborhood. And in this school, what we found, the way schools worked at the time in Denver, if they were a charter school, which this one did, is schools in Colorado had 3 years to prove with data that they were a valid way of teaching and working with students. So my students that were in this school had been through like 7 or 8 different school styles by the time I had them in 8th grade. And none of my students were English speaking as their first language. Most of my students were immigrants, and a lot of my students we saw seasonally based on when they could recross the border safely, because we knew a lot of that was what part of their culture was. So our teaching had to be very different. And knowing a lot of what happened to my students, one of the best things that we implemented as a big group was we decided for 45 minutes every day, we brought back the idea of homeroom, but we called it a home base. This was your base, this was your safe teacher, this was who you were going to work with. And we really focused on bringing that cultural piece into their classrooms and really getting to know our students as much as we could. So a good example for myself was, especially in Latinx communities and my home, like cooking is a really big piece. And that's not something that was related to our curriculum. Like I was the math and the science teacher. And I spent a lot of time, I had a group of 10 boys and we cooked and we talked and just, we made lunch together, and doing those kinds of things was able to learn a lot more about what was important to them in their home. And that was how they opened up in this way. And how, to me, really made those ways that I could connect with those 10 boys, but overall, the rest of the students that I taught that had very similar experiences. So, it's something that I've continued to try to work on. Like for myself, I know that it's a continual process of learning. So, how can I improve is just continually reflecting on, am I doing this? Am I making sure, especially in New Mexico, we have such a variety of ways to teach or types of students we teach. Am I honoring that? And I don't feel like I do it well. But there's, I think, the intention of trying to make sure that we do it well. And so, if that document, I shared it with you guys, you're welcome to keep it. Just make a copy of the document and you can save it as your own in a Google Drive. And you can work towards that activity at home, just looking at maybe a lesson that you've worked on or created, and think about like what those standards are and how you can incorporate it. And with that, I will go back to Eileen.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you to you, Vanessa, and thank you to you, Tally, for sharing so many different things for us to think about. And thank you to all of you who have engaged and participated with us today.